Hello everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I am your resident fantasy therapist and welcome to my channel. Those of you who are returning, welcome back. Those of you who are brand new, my name is Kat Bowser. I am a licensed therapist, but I am also an author working on my first debut novel, Coexist Division. And on my channel, I like to talk about all things writing, all things world building, and everything that goes in between, as well as kind of inviting you guys to join me on my journey towards publication. So for this video is actually one I've been planning for a while, and it actually took a little longer than I planned, so I apologize for that. But today I thought we would talk on a topic of world building that I don't see get a lot of attention, but I have seen quite a few people ask me my opinions on it, so here we go. So today we're going to be talking about keeping scale when you world build. Okay, so when we talk about scale in world building, it can actually mean a couple of different things. For this video, I'm focusing on both macro and micro. And for the macro, that is essentially what it sounds like, which is the wide view of scale in your world. A lot of people who are familiar with Tolkien, Dune, things of that nature, you understand fantasy maps that have a scale to it, which is essentially, for an inch, it's every 500 miles. Basic geography stuff that we all learned probably in fourth grade and have completely forgotten about. But that's not necessarily what I'm talking about here, although it does come into play a little bit. What I'm talking about is how can you present how large, how far away things are in your world to your reader in a way they can conceptualize. And I think conceptualize is the key word here, because generally there are two ways that people conceptualize things. They either do it on what I call a tangible scale, or some people call it logical, or they do it in the abstract way. And logical, the best way I can think of to describe it, these are people that have a very mathematical way of thinking about things. So if you describe to someone, okay, it's going to be 500 miles from this town to the main city my character's getting to, they can understand that because that's how their brain works. They can understand, okay, a mile is this long, so 500 miles means it's going to be about this long. But not a lot of people think that way, particularly within the creative arts. Most of the time, people who are very good in creative arts, as a general, were not so good in math. That tends to be more about how we process things than anything, because people who are very creative, we usually have very abstract ways of thinking. And so that's why I think it's important to present your world not only with logical measurements, but also with abstract ways of picturing distance, height, things of that nature. So how do we go about this? Well, as a general rule, as humans, we work very well with comparison. When we are young, there's actually a theory on development. It's called the schema theory, which is basically how children learn to categorize things as we grow. So when a child first learns to categorize things, they take specific characteristics and they attach them to certain animals or people or environments, and they say, okay, if it has these characteristics, then it's this. For example, a very young child will often call a dog and a cat the same animal until they're corrected, because in their mind, if it has 4 legs and it has a tail, then it's a dog or it's a cat, depending on which they've been exposed to. But once they've been told, well, the cat says meow, the dog says bark, okay, now we have 2 categories. And then they build other animals and other environments off of that information. So for your story, I think that's something to keep in mind, is what are the major extremes in your world? I'll use that as an example, because think about how we compare things when we talk about things. I don't know a lot of people that use the logical approach. Most people I know will describe things as, oh, it was heavy as a ton of bricks. It was as large as the Empire State Building, things like that. Those of you who have a world that is based in our world, yay, you have a heads up, because you can still use some of those landmarks. So how do we establish landmarks in your world? I think the easiest way to go about this is to determine two things. What are the extremes in your world? What is the tallest thing in your world? What is the deepest thing in your world? Smallest, so on and so forth. Because those are going to be things that your characters are naturally going to compare things to. So, a good example in my work in progress, there is a mountain range, and the tallest mountain is called Nasku, which means literally touch to the mother goddess in their language. And the reason it's called that is because you can't even see the top of it, because it stretches into the sky and there's clouds surrounding and obscuring the top. So according to legend, there isn't even a top. You climb through to the top and you reach wherever their mother goddess is. So while I'm not giving an exact number of how high it is, I am giving an idea of it is high enough that people don't even know what's at the top. So as a general, people are going to contribute to, okay, that's pretty high. And I can use this to describe how tall or how far away certain other things are. For example, there is an isle called the Isle of Bones in my work in progress that is said to be 3 mountain peaks from the coast. So essentially 3 mountains laid next to each other. And if we know how tall the tallest mountain is, then we need to establish how tall is the smallest mountain, which is something else that you can bring up in your works. For example, I believe I talk about the smallest mountain once or twice when they're basically kids daring each other, like, oh, okay, you want to go climb a mountain, make sure it's bigger than whatever the smallest mountain is. I actually haven't named it yet. But those are ways that you can kind of contribute. Okay, the smallest mountain is so small that even elementary school kids don't consider it a challenge. Okay, so it's not that big. Tallest mountain, can't even see the top. Okay, that's important to know. So an average mountain peak would be in between those two. So that kind of gives you a sense of distance from the shore to the Isle of Bones. And a best way I know to think about it is, for example, if you guys were to talk about our world and we're trying to determine how deep is the Mariana Trench. And I've seen different ways that people describe this. The best way that I saw to describe it, though, was if you turned Mount Everest upside down, you would still have, I think they said, about 2 to 3 miles at the bottom. And that's a little easier for a lot of people to conceptualize, is, okay, so this is deep enough that the tallest mountain on our planet fits inside of it and has room to spare. Because the mind doesn't need to know exact numbers to get an idea of, okay, this is big, this is large, this is deep. And so that, I think, is what is important to keep in mind when you're developing ways to talk about scale in your world, is you don't need exact numbers. You just need a general idea. Okay, this person is approaching a kingdom that is so high, so we're gonna say it's halfway up, not school, so about halfway up to heaven, essentially. Tall. We can also use this to talk about speed. If you think about in our world, generally, if something's slow, we're going to compare it to a snail. We're going to compare it to a turtle. If something is fast, we're usually going to talk about a cheetah, in some cases a falcon. So in your world, make sure that you kind of talk about what are the common comparisons for speed, both slow and fast, and you can use that to describe speed or time when you're talking about it in your work in progress. So that is essentially the macro scale. The micro scale is when we're talking about scale between characters. So essentially, how big are such and such character compared to another character? And again, I think comparison is the best way to go about this. But with main characters, I think something else that makes this a lot easier, and I will pull it up for you guys on the screen right now, model sheets. There are reasons that movies and cartoons use model sheets, and that is to keep proportions constant so that they don't shift and change. It's actually a complaint that quite a few kids have had, is that the proportions of characters change and shift through a show, and unless there's reasons given for it, aka the character's aging, usually kind of irritates people a little bit because it's usually quite obvious. So I'll be the first to say I am not an artist at all. I am not good at it. I do not claim to be good at it. But for model sheets, you don't really need to be good at it. You just need to have a basic shape. So for example, in this model sheet, I have Ani, who is the shortest of my main characters because he's only about 7 years old. And then I have the tallest of my main characters is Nali, who is a stoneman, who in my world is a form of dwarf, but they don't call them dwarves because they're not small. They're quite tall, actually. So I have the smallest, I have the tallest, and then I figure out the other characters in between. I also have model sheets for secondary characters. So these are characters that my main characters are primarily going to interact with. So they're the ones I need to know, okay, how do these guys measure up to these other characters? So how tall is Ani compared to, for instance, his best friend Tony, who is a little taller than him. Ani comes about to his chin, give or take. But then you also have characters like Taran, who is Nali's uncle, who is fully grown, probably mid-40s in their world terms, so he's not going to get any taller. But Nali, even though he's about the equivalent of a teenager in their terms, he only comes up about to his uncle's chest. So if I'm going to have Ani meet with Taran, I need to know how tall is he compared to Nali, and how tall is Nali compared to his uncle. So these model sheets kind of help you to keep that in mind. And I think another thing that they can do, that I recommend you do, is you take one of your main model sheets when you're done, and you take one of your key landmarks that we established in the micro section part, and you just, or the macro section part, I'm sorry, and you put them next to each other just so you have a sense of scale. So if the tallest character in my story is Taran, I want to know, what does he look like next to their tallest mountain? Or what does he look like next to one of their average ships? And again, you don't have to be a good artist to do this, because all you're looking at, you're not looking at details, you're just looking at how do these things look like next to each other. And that makes it easier for you to keep perspective in mind when you're describing characters meeting or going to certain areas. So, for example, the stonemen, like I said, they're not short, they're actually quite tall. But Ani is very short. So if he is suddenly in the kingdom of the stonemen and he is seeing some of their average tools, most of their tools are almost as big as he is, just because that is the vast difference in their size. Whereas if the stonemen go to visit some of the Natu, who are generally much shorter, they're not going to even be able to use most of their furniture. They're going to be too big for it. And I think these are little things that if you can describe it in your work in progress, you can make it much more real for your readers. Like, okay, I understand that Taran is so big he can't even get in the house of all the Natu. So, okay, so now I have a better picture in my mind. And I think an important thing to keep in mind when you're doing scale is that scale can be altered depending on the situation. And what I mean by that is that if your characters are scared or anxious, things are going to seem much bigger than they actually are. And the reason for this is that when we're scared or nervous, our adrenaline is pumping. And when your adrenaline is pumping, it is looking everywhere for a threat, anything that might be perceived as a threat. And to protect you, it tells you that's dangerous. When something looks dangerous, we try to avoid it. So if I have Ani meet Taran for the first time, and he towers over him normally, but this is a situation where he doesn't know if he's going to get out with his head intact, he's going to seem even bigger to Ani because of that fear. So That's something to keep in mind. And I think the last thing I want to talk about with scale is that scale is something that you're likely going to edit as you go along in your story. When you do your first draft, your scale is not going to be 100%. You're going to go back through and do your edits and be like, oh, great, this doesn't make any sense. That's okay. That's what edits are for. But that's also why I recommend that you establish certain landmarks of your world. The on the extreme scale, like I talked about, what's the smallest, what's the biggest, what's the fastest, what's the slowest, what's the deepest, what's the highest, because those are things that people are naturally going to use. Another thing to keep in mind is just what are the natural landmarks of the areas that your characters are going to be at, because there's landmarks everywhere. We all use them. If I'm directing someone to come to my house, I'm going to most likely tell them, if you go past, the Circle K with the missing gas pump, you've gone too far, because those are easy ways to direct people. They're easy ways to say, okay, I know where I am now. So I think it's important to establish some basic ones for your world. You don't have to establish all of them, but you should establish some. And that's all I really have for you guys today in regards to scale. I think this is a really interesting topic because it is something that I don't see addressed a lot in fantasy, but I do think it's very, very important when you're making your world. So thank you guys for asking for this topic. I hope to see you guys again soon. Maybe I'll have another topic on some more world building ideas. I have a couple in mind. I know people have been asking about how do you create a language, what about a fictional religion, things of that nature. So if you guys have any suggestions, comments, please let me know. You can also follow me on social media. I always welcome any questions from you guys. So with that being said, I hope to see you guys soon and have a good one.